Onyx, we are blind down here. The plaza is too loud. Do you have PID on the primary? The radio crackled with Trench's breathless voice. He was ex-Navy SEAL, a man who rarely panicked, but the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of suppressed gunfire bleeding through his comms told a different story. Valeria Onyx Silva kept her eye pressed firmly to the optic of her Accuracy International AXSR, her breathing deliberately shallow. Through the thermal imaging, the historic Naples piazza was a chaotic, shifting canvas of panicking tourists and darting shadows. 6 distinct heat signatures were moving in a tactical wedge formation toward Trench's extraction point. I have 6 unidentified armed elements. Valeria said, her finger resting just a millimeter outside the trigger guard. Distance 690. Wind is half value left to right, but they're using the crowd as a meat shield. Corporate says weapons free on anyone advancing on the asset. We need a path Onyx 10 seconds before they completely overrun us and take the drive. Through the scope, Valeria watched the lead figure wrap a thick arm around a civilian woman, pulling her into his chest as he raised a submachine gun toward Trench's last known position. If Valeria fired the .338 Lapua Magnum rounds over penetration, would undoubtedly kill the woman. If she didn't, her contractor team would be wiped out, and the rogue AI architect they were hired to extract would be captured. Onyx, take the shot. Fucking shoot, the former SEAL roared. Valeria exhaled the reticle, settling perfectly between the hostile's eyes. The corporate contract didn't cover collateral damage. Her finger slipped inside the trigger guard. Transmission breaks. Silence. 14 hours earlier, Aegis Defense safe house outskirts of Naples, the dust in the bell tower of Santa Maria del Carmine, tasted like crushed brick and centuries of forgotten prayers. Valeria Onyx. Silva lay perfectly still on the decaying wooden floorboards, her body molded into the shadows of the belfry. The Mediterranean sun was relentless, baking the stone walls and turning the narrow space into a convection oven, but Valeria hadn't twitched in 45 minutes. Through the high magnification optic of her Accuracy International AXSR sniper rifle, she watched the world below. Piazza del Plebiscito was a sprawling, sun-drenched amphitheater of chaos. From 690 meters away, the tourists looked like brightly colored insects swarming the grand colonnades. Street musicians played accordions that she couldn't hear their movements, frantic and joyful. The sheer volume of humanity was a tactical nightmare. It was a sea of shifting variables, unpredictable trajectories, and immense corporate liability. Onyx, this is Trench. Comcheck. Over. The voice of Marcus Cole buzzed in her earpiece, sharp and deeply resonant. He was an ex-Navy SEAL who had traded the Trident for a PMC paycheck, but the rigid military cadence never entirely left him. Trench Onyx. Solid copy. I have the plaza in sight. Wind is 3 knots coming off the bay. Visibility is clear, but the heat mirage is kicking up near the Basilica steps. Valeria's voice was a flat, emotionless drawl. It was a conscious effort. In this line of work, adrenaline was just another variable that ruined your math. Copy that. We are 2 mics out from the RV point. Do you have eyes on the asset? Valeria made a micro-adjustment to the turrets on her scope, tracking across the steps of the Grand Church. The rules of engagement for this Aegis defense contract were hammered into her brain during the brief 0 collateral liability. Do not engage unless the asset is compromised. We are ghosts today. Aegis wasn't paying her to fight a war. They were paying her to ensure a defecting AI architect and the billion-dollar proprietary code in his pocket made it to an armored extraction vehicle without the Italian authorities or rival corporations noticing. Negative on the asset, Trench. The crowd is dense. Keep your heads on a swivel. She panned the optic left. Her crosshairs glided over a laughing teenager with a gelato, a couple posing for a selfie, a flock of pigeons erupting into the sky. She used the scope as a barrier, a glass wall that separated her from the flesh and blood below. To a PMC sniper, civilians weren't people. They were fleshy obstacles that could void a multi-million-dollar payout if a bullet happened to pass through them. Then her reticle stopped. Near the northern colonnade, leaning against a marble pillar, stood a man. The ambient temperature in Naples was currently 32 degrees Celsius. The man was wearing a tailored suit, but it wasn't his clothing that caught her eye. It was his posture. He was completely ignoring the bustling plaza, his head angled downward, staring intently at a modified, bulky smartphone in his hand. A directional scanner. Valeria's pulse gave a solitary hard thud against her ribs. She dialed up the magnification. He was sweeping the device in slow, methodical arcs toward the southern entrance of the plaza, the exact avenue of approach Trench's team was scheduled to use. Trench Onyx, be advised. I have a visual anomaly. Northern colonnade, fourth pillar from the left. Euro male, mid-30s. He's running a directional scanner, likely looking for the asset's encrypted beacon. Copy, honest, Trench replied, his tone tightening. Do you have PID on a weapon? Valeria squinted, fighting the distortion of the heat waves radiating off the cobblestones. Negative. Jacket is fitted, but there's a slight bulge at the right hip. Could be a compact sidearm or a comms rig. Understood. Control, this is Trench. Request permission for Onyx to paint the target or take a preemptive posture. A pause stretched on the encrypted satellite network. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The silence of corporate risk assessors weighing human lives against public relations fallout. Trench, this is Control. The sterile, synthesized voice of the Aegis handler crackled. Negative on posture change. ROE remains absolute. Do not escalate. You do not have PID of a lethal threat. The local carabinieri presence is too high. Proceed to the handoff. Valeria closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the surge of professional disgust. The corporate rulebook didn't account for instinct. It didn't account for the cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Copy, Control. Trench said, though Valeria could hear the barely suppressed anger of a man who knew he was being ordered to walk into a trap. Onyx, we are entering the plaza. Keep an eye on our ghost. Roger that. Through the scope, Valeria watched 3 men in plain clothes seamlessly blend into the crowd, moving with predatory grace toward the center of the piazza. Trench had arrived. She swung the crosshairs back to the man with the scanner. He had stopped leaning against the pillar. He was standing up straight now, slipping the device into his pocket and reaching his right hand under his tailored jacket. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the dust around Valeria's boots. She adjusted her windage dial by a quarter MOA without taking her eye off the glass. The plaza below was too loud, too crowded, too chaotic. It was a corporate liability nightmare. And as the man drew a suppressed submachine gun from beneath his coat, Valeria realized the paycheck wasn't going to be worth the blood she was about to shed. Trench break. Anomaly is armed. Suppressed submachine gun drawn under the jacket. I have PID of a lethal threat. Valeria's thumb hovered over the safety selector of her AXSR. Say again, Onyx, your signal is... Trench's voice dissolved into a harsh, crackling hiss of white noise. Valeria tapped her earpiece. Trench, do you copy, Control? This is Onyx. We are experiencing localized electronic interference. Silence. The Aegis Defense encrypted satellite link was dead. The man in the tailored suit hadn't just pulled a weapon. He had activated a localized frequency jammer. Valeria's fingers flew across her comms rig, initiating a rapid frequency hopping protocol, desperately trying to catch Trench on a peer-to-peer tactical mesh network. "Nix, talk to me." Trench's voice finally broke through the static, distorted, and heavily fragmented. "Hostile is armed, Trench. Northern colonnade. He's jamming the main feed." Valeria shifted her optic, rapidly searching the crowd for the AI engineer. She found him near the center of the piazza, clutching a reinforced metallic briefcase to his chest. The asset was a thin, nervous man, sweating profusely in a rumpled suit. He was looking wildly around the plaza, waiting for the prearranged Aegis contact phrase. But the engineer didn't see Trench. He saw Trench's two flankers, Alpha and Bravo, moving in a synchronized predatory wedge through the crowd. To a terrified civilian carrying a billion-dollar stolen algorithm, highly trained PMC operators closing in looked exactly like the corporate assassins he was fleeing. The engineer panicked. He spun on his heel and sprinted in the opposite direction, violently shoving past a group of tourists, violating every single protocol of the extraction plan. "Asset is spooked. He's breaking south." Valeria snapped over the radio. "Say damn it," Trench growled. "Alpha Bravo, collapse on the asset. Go loud if you have to. We are losing him." Before the Aegis operators could close the distance, the man in the tailored suit made his move. He didn't fire the submachine gun. Instead, he withdrew a small silver cylinder from his pocket, twisted the cap, and rolled it smoothly across the cobblestones, directly into the center of the densest pocket of tourists. Valeria recognized the device a fraction of a second before it detonated. It wasn't high explosive. It was a localized sonic flash bang, a military-grade crowd dispersal munition. The device didn't boom. It shrieked. A piercing, high-pitched whine ripped across the piazza, a sound so violently loud and disorienting, it literally vibrated against the thick stone walls of Valeria's bell tower, 690 meters away. Down in the plaza, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Thousands of people dropped their gelato, their cameras, their shopping bags, and clutched their ears in pure agony. A collective scream of sheer terror rose from the mob. Then the stampede began. It was a tidal wave of panicked humanity. The meticulously planned corporate extraction dissolved into a terrifying riot. People shoved, trampled, and sprinted blindly to escape the agonizing noise, creating an unpredictable, swirling vortex of bodies. And under the cover of the screaming crowd, the syndicate hit squad began their work. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The distinct muffled coughs of suppressed weapons echoed off the ancient colonnades. It wasn't just the man in the tailored suit. Muzzle flashes flickered from the shadows of a souvenir stand and the awning of a nearby cafe. 3 shooters expertly camouflaged, firing with lethal precision into the chaos. Through the thermal optic, Valeria watched Bravo Trench's right flank operator jerk violently backward. A dark mist of arterial spray painted the white marble of a nearby statue before the heavy-set PMC collapsed beneath the trampling feet of the crowd. "By Bravo is down. We are taking fire from multiple vectors." Trench bellowed over the degrading mesh network. "Onyx, we are blind down here. Give me a vector." Valeria's eye was glued to the scope, her breathing shallow, but her heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic, uncharacteristic rhythm. Her cynical detachment, the cool corporate armor that reduced lives to liability clauses and profit margins, shattered instantly. That wasn't just a compromised asset bleeding out on the stone. That was Bravo. That was a man she had shared a stale espresso with 6 hours ago. It was no longer a contract. It was survival. She racked the bolt of the AXSR, sliding a massive .338 Lapua Magnum round into the chamber with a satisfying metallic clack. She tracked the man in the tailored suit. He was moving smoothly through the screaming mob, using the terrified civilians as dynamic, fleshy cover to close the distance on Trench. Valeria found his center mass. Her finger tightened on the curved metal of the trigger. Suddenly, a mother dragging a crying child darted directly across her line of sight, completely eclipsing the target. Valeria yanked her finger off the trigger, her breath catching sharply in her throat. The corporate ROE screamed in her head, zero collateral liability. If she pulled the trigger and a civilian died, Aegis Defense would disavow her, frame her, and leave her to rot in an Italian black site to protect their stock price. She swung the heavy rifle toward the souvenir stand. Another syndicate shooter. Center mass. An elderly man was shoved violently into the shooter's path by the stampede. Valeria swore vividly, abandoning the shot. The syndicate mercenaries knew exactly what they were doing. They were weaponizing the crowd, hiding within the panic, rendering a sniper's overwatch utterly useless. Onyx, talk to me. Trench yelled, his voice laced with the brutal exertion of dragging Bravo's dead weight behind a thick stone fountain. Bullets sparked off the masonry inches from his head, chipping away their only cover. I need a firing solution. Valeria stared through the high-end glass at the swirling, terrifying sea of bodies. The noise in her earpiece was a sickening cacophony of panicked breathing and ricocheting lead. She had the high ground, she had the most powerful weapon in the plaza, and she was completely, utterly paralyzed by the crowd. I have no shot, Trench. Valeria said, the cold realization settling heavily in her chest. There are too many bodies. I am blind. The Piazza del Plebiscito had devolved from a sunlit tourist destination into a swirling, screaming meat grinder. Through the magnification of the AI-AXSR optic, Valeria watched the stampede crush itself against the narrow exits of the colonnades. It was a tidal wave of panic, a completely unpredictable environment that rendered precision mathematics nearly impossible. Onyx, talk to me. They're flanking Alpha. Trench's voice was a ragged bark over the peer-to-peer mesh network. The rhythmic crack, crack, crack of incoming fire punctuated his words, drowning out the ambient screams of the crowd. Valeria keyed her radio, her thumb pressing so hard against the PTT button that the plastic groaned. Control, this is Onyx. The extraction is fully compromised. Asset is loose in the grid. Trident is pinned. I am requesting immediate authorization to engage with extreme prejudice. Suspend the liability clause. Silence. The Aegis encrypted satellite channel didn't even offer the hum of static. It was a dead, heavy void. Control, authenticate. Valeria demanded, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, mechanical cadence she reserved for combat. Nothing. The localized jammer deployed by the syndicate shouldn't have been able to sever the hardened satellite uplink entirely unless Aegis Control had intentionally cut the feed from their end. A cold realization settled into the marrow of Valeria's bones. The corporation wasn't just observing the disaster. They were cutting their losses. To the risk assessors sitting in a pristine, air-conditioned boardroom in Geneva, Trench, Alpha, and Valeria were already written off as acceptable collateral. Onyx, we have 60 seconds of ammunition left. Trench gasped. Alpha is hit in the ceramic plate. We cannot move. Do you have a firing solution? The corporate ROE flashed brilliantly in her mind, zero collateral liability. If she fired and hit a civilian, Aegis Defense would disavow her feed, her dossier to Interpol, and let her rot in a black site to protect their stock price. But if she didn't fire, the men she drank with, bled with, and trusted with her life would be butchered on the cobblestones. To hell with the contract, Valeria whispered. She shifted the heavy metallic chassis of the AXSR. Trench, Onyx. I am weapons free. Engaging confirmed threats. Keep your heads down. Valeria exhaled a long, controlled stream of air that seemed to push the chaos of the world out of her mind. She became the rifle. The environment dissolved into raw, calculable data, distant 685 meters to the cafe awning, where the heaviest suppressive fire was originating. Wind. It was swirling violently in the bowl of the piazza, but the dust kicked up by the stampede told her it had picked up to 4 knots full value from the left. She reached up without looking, her gloved fingers deftly clicking the windage turret 2 tactile notches. She tracked the muzzle flashes beneath the striped awning. The shooter was a professional kneeling behind a thick marble cafe table, rhythmically pouring fire into Trench's position. But he was smart. He had positioned himself directly behind a terrified cluster of tourists huddled against the cafe's exterior wall. Valeria found his shoulder in the crosshairs, then tracked up to the exposed sliver of his neck. It was a shot the size of a grapefruit, constantly obscured by flailing limbs and screaming civilians. Her finger curled around the trigger. She took up the slack. Suddenly, a teenage boy in a bright yellow windbreaker, violently shoved by the surging crowd, stumbled directly into her line of sight. He froze, paralyzed by pure terror, standing perfectly between the muzzle of Valeria's rifle and the syndicate shooter. Valeria's heart slammed against her ribs. Abort. She stopped her breathing, entirely holding her lungs in agonizing suspension. The boy was sobbing, his hands clamped over his ears. If she pulled the trigger now, the massive 250-grain armor-piercing bullet would tear through the boy's chest before it ever reached the target. "Move! Please move!" Down below, the syndicate shooter adjusted his aim, preparing to deliver a fatal burst into Trench's degrading cover. A woman grabbed the boy by the collar, violently yanking him out of the kill zone and back into the crush of the crowd. The window opened. It was less than a second. Valeria squeezed the trigger. The AIAXSR roared. The brutal recoil punched into her shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer, rocking her frame backward. In the confined, dusty space of the bell tower, the unsuppressed muzzle blast was deafening, a concussive shockwave that sent centuries of dirt raining down from the rafters. The sharp, acrid scent of burnt cordite instantly flooded her nostrils. She didn't blink. She fought the violent recoil, instantly cycling the bolt and dragging the optic back onto the target. The heavy brass casing spun through the air, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. Through the glass, the result was devastating. The syndicate shooter had been thrown violently backward, the marble cafe table shattering beneath his collapsing weight. The threat was neutralized. "Target down!" Valeria called out, her voice eerily calm over the chaotic mesh network. "Trench, you have a temporary window on your left flank. Move now." "Copy, Onyx moving," Trench yelled, but the shot carried a massive cost. The .338 Lapua Magnum was an anti-material round. It was not subtle, and it was not quiet. The concussive boom had echoed off the stone facades of the piazza, effectively ringing a dinner bell for every hostile in the grid. Valeria rapidly scanned the plaza, looking for the primary threat, the man in the tailored suit who had initiated the ambush. He was no longer firing. He was standing near the center of the square, perfectly still amidst the panicked civilians streaming past him. He was looking up, straight up at the bell tower of Santa Maria del Carmine. He tapped his earpiece, speaking rapidly, and then pointed a gloved finger directly at Valeria's hide. "Onyx, be advised." Trench barked over the radio, his breathing ragged as he dragged Alpha to a new piece of masonry. "The hostiles are shifting focus. They know exactly where you are." Valeria chambered another round. "Let them come. I have the high ground." But the syndicate wasn't sending foot soldiers up the narrow, winding stairs. From the back of a parked delivery van on the northern edge of the piazza, a high-pitched mechanical whine sliced through the ambient noise of the screaming crowd. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets, Valeria swung her optic toward the sound. A sleek quad-rotor drone lifted off the roof of the van. It wasn't a commercial model. It was matte black, armored and slung underneath its chassis was a compact explosive payload alongside a high-definition thermal camera. The hunter-killer drone banked sharply, ascending with terrifying, unnatural speed. Its camera lens articulated upwards, locking directly onto the open archway of the bell tower. Trench. Valeria said, the cold knot returning to her stomach. I have a new problem. The high-pitched whine of the quad-rotor drone cut through the cacophony of the piazza like a scalpel. Valeria Onyx Silva didn't flinch, but her grip on the AXSR sniper rifle tightened until her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Through the high-definition thermal optic, the drone was a blindingly hot star ascending rapidly toward her position in the bell tower of Santa Maria del Carmine. It moved with unnatural predatory agility, banking sharply to avoid the ancient stone colonnades and the frantic masses below. Onyx status, I have hostiles flanking the fountain. Trench's voice was a desperate, ragged rasp over the localized tactical network. The sounds of heavy, suppressed gunfire chewed the air around him. Alpha is Winchester on his primary. He's transitioning to his sidearm. The asset caught a graze to the shoulder. He is bleeding and panicking. I need that firing solution now. Stand by, Trench. I am tracking an inbound aerial threat. Valeria replied, her voice an icy contrast to the chaos below. She swung the heavy muzzle of the .338 Lapua Magnum, attempting to lead the erratic flight path of the drone. It was too fast for a standard commercial payload. As it crested the roofline of the nearby basilica, the Mediterranean sun caught the matte black composite of its chassis. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. She dialed the magnification ring to maximum, pushing through the thick heat mirage. The drone didn't bear the haphazard, pieced-together modifications of a syndicate weapon. It was sleek, aerodynamic, and carried a highly distinctive teardrop-shaped thermal optics pod slung beneath its belly. Painted in a muted, low-visibility gray on the rotor struts was a stylized emblem, a shattered shield. It was an Aegis Defense XR-7 Valkyrie. The cold knot in Valeria's stomach froze solid. The Valkyrie wasn't a reconnaissance drone. It was a proprietary, heavily restricted hunter-killer platform utilized exclusively by Aegis corporate cleanup crews, the Black Ops teams dispatched to erase evidence and silence liabilities when a corporate contract went fatally south. The midpoint shift slammed into her with the physical force of a shockwave. Aegis Control hadn't lost the satellite uplink due to syndicate jamming. They had severed it intentionally. The corporation wasn't simply cutting their losses. They were actively orchestrating the slaughter of their own extraction team. The boardroom accountants in Geneva must have run the numbers. Paying Trench's team the exorbitant extraction fee, dealing with the international fallout of a messy shootout in Naples, and managing the unpredictable AI engineer was simply too costly. It was far cheaper and far cleaner to strike a backdoor deal with the syndicate hand over the engineer and let the syndicate wipe out the Aegis operators as part of the transaction. No witnesses, no payouts, just a tragic, unforeseen ambush. Valeria perched in the ultimate Overwatch position, with a clear view of the entire betrayal, was the single greatest liability left on the board. The Valkyrie drone abruptly halted its ascent, hovering perfectly still 80 meters out, suspended in the bright Italian sky. Its thermal camera articulated upward, locking directly onto the dark archway of Valeria's belfry. A red laser diode blinked to life on its undercarriage, painting the ancient stone wall inches from Valeria's face. The targeting sequence for its micro-missile payload had initiated. They are moving on us. Where is my support? Trench roared. Valeria had 2 seconds. If she rolled backward into the cover of the stairwell, she would survive the drone's explosive payload, but she would lose her vantage point entirely. Trench and Alpha would be slaughtered by the advancing syndicate mercenaries before the dust even settled in the bell tower. The corporate contract dictated she prioritize her own survival to avoid compromising company assets. Valeria exhaled the metallic taste of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated betrayal flooding her mouth. The contract was dead. She didn't move an inch. She held her ground perfectly exposed in the archway, the red laser dot sliding slowly across her cheek toward her eye. She centered the crosshairs on the Valkyrie's teardrop optics pod. She squeezed the trigger. The AXSR roared, the brutal recoil punching her shoulder. The .338 Lapua Magnum round crossed the 80-meter gap in a fraction of a heartbeat. The Valkyrie didn't just break, it violently detonated. The armor-piercing round struck the drone's micro-missile payload mid-arming sequence. A brilliant, deafening fireball erupted in the sky above the piazza, raining flaming composite shrapnel and shattered rotors down onto the screaming crowd below. Valeria aggressively cycled the bolt, ejecting the smoking brass casing, the mechanical clack, echoing in the ringing silence of her own ears. On-aerial threat neutralized. Valeria said, her voice dropping into a lethal, terrifying calm. She immediately swung the heavy rifle back down toward the plaza, scanning the mob for the syndicate mercenaries pushing on Trench. Trench, listen to me very carefully. I'm here, Onyx. What the hell was that explosion? That was an Aegis Valkyrie drone. Valeria said, her eye never leaving the glass as she tracked a hostile moving between the marble pillars. Corporate didn't just abandon us, Marcus. They sold us to the syndicate. They jammed the uplink and sent a cleaner drone to silence my hide. We are the severance package. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the tactical network, broken only by the ragged breathing of the ex-SEAL and the distant echoing pop of incoming gunfire. Copy, Trench finally said. The rigid military formality was gone. It was replaced by the cold, hard edge of a man who realized he was a ghost walking. What's the play, Valeria? He used her real name. The PMC call signs were officially meaningless. They were no longer Aegis operators protecting an asset. They were 3 dead men and a sniper entirely on their own in a city actively trying to kill them. None. The play is, we survive. Valeria said, her reticle settling on the chest of a syndicate mercenary, aiming a rifle at Trench's exposed flank. I have your left. Move the asset toward the catacombs. We break every rule they gave us. The flaming wreckage of the Aegis Valkyrie drone rained down upon Piazza del Plebiscito, scattering terrified tourists and sending plumes of acrid black smoke into the Mediterranean sky. In the bell tower of Santa Maria del Carmine, Valeria Onyx Silva briefly pulled her eye away from the optic of the AIAXSR. The air in the belfry was thick with the suffocating smell of burnt composite and vaporized lithium. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out her Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter, holding it up to the open archway. The data scrolling across the small digital screen was a nightmare. The thermal updrafts from the burning drone wreckage on the cobblestones, combined with the frantic movement of thousands of fleeing bodies, had shattered the predictable sea breeze. The wind was now a chaotic, swirling vortex shifting violently between 3 and 7 knots. Trench sitrep. Valeria demanded, her voice an icy blade slicing through the frantic static of the peer-to-peer network. She rapidly adjusted the windage and elevation turrets on her scope, factoring in the erratic data. We are pinned behind the fractured base of the obelisk. Trench gasped. The sound of heavy 5.56mm rounds chewing into the ancient marble behind him was deafening over the comms. Alpha is bleeding from a fragmentation hit to the thigh. The asset is hyperventilating. We cannot hold this position. I need a path to the basilica doors. The catacomb entrance is just inside the vestibule. Valeria leaned back into the rifle, sweeping the heavy optic toward the grand steps of the basilica. Her blood ran cold. The massive towering pillars of the colonnade completely bisected her line of sight. From the deep concealment of the belfry shadows, she had a fractured, narrow view of the steps. It was a tactical blind spot. "The Marcus," Valeria said, using his real name again, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her lungs. "The angle to the basilica doors is severely obstructed by the pillars. If you make the run from the obelisk to the steps, I cannot cover your six from the shadows. Maybe then we die right here." Trench stated flatly, the grim resignation of a cornered operator settling into his tone. "Alpha is Winchester on his primary. He just dumped his last rifle mag. I have maybe 30 rounds left. The syndicate is bounding forward." Valeria stared at the suffocating darkness of the bell tower. For 10 years in the private military sector, the absolute golden rule of Overwatch had been hammered into her skull: never compromise your hide. You are useless to the team if you are dead. The corporate contract demanded self-preservation to protect company assets, but the contract was ashes. Aegis Defense wanted them dead. The only thing left in the world that mattered was the bleeding men shivering behind a shattered obelisk 690 meters away. "Stand by," Valeria whispered. She gripped the chassis of the AXSR. Her shoulders burned with lactic acid from holding the heavy weapon steady for over an hour, but she ignored the agonizing fire in her muscles. Slowly, deliberately, Valeria crawled forward. She pushed past the shadows of the belfry, dragging her rifle over the rough centuries-old dust, until she reached the crumbling outer stone ledge of the tower. She didn't stop. Valeria pushed her torso over the lip of the balustrade, exposing herself entirely to the blinding Italian sun and the chaotic plaza below. She was no longer a ghost hidden in the dark. She was a glaring, obvious silhouette perched on the highest structure in the grid. "Onyx, what are you doing?" Trench demanded, hearing the scraping of stone over the open mic. "Getting an angle," Valeria replied coldly. She mounted the bipod of the sniper rifle directly onto the exposed stone railing. The entire right flank of the plaza, all the way to the basilica steps, suddenly opened up in her optic. There were no more blind spots, but every single syndicate mercenary in the piazza now had a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the sniper who was tearing them apart. Auditory exclusion immediately set in. The screaming of the crowd and the wailing of distant police sirens faded into a dull, rushing hum in her ears. Her entire universe shrank to the circular lens of the thermal optic. "Move now, Marcus. I have the steps." Alpha grabbed the asset. "We push on 3, Trench roared. Through the glass, Valeria watched Trench break from the cover of the obelisk, laying down a furious, suppressive burst of fire from his rifle, while Alpha violently dragged the terrified AI engineer by the collar toward the basilica. Instantly, the syndicate reacted. From the shadows of the colonnade, 6 distinct thermal signatures detached from the panicked mob. They didn't move like the chaotic, opportunistic shooters from the initial ambush. These men moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, forming a tactical wedge designed to cut off Trench's avenue of approach. They were elite, the syndicate's heavy assault element held in reserve until the Aegis drone failed. Valeria tracked the trailing operator of the wedge. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink. She squeezed the trigger. The AXSR bucked violently against her shoulder. The .338 Lapua round tore through the swirling wind and instantly shattered the trailing mercenary's chest plate, throwing his lifeless body backward onto the cobblestones. She rapidly cycled the bolt, ejecting the smoking brass over the ledge. The mechanical action was flawless, driven by pure muscle memory. But the remaining 5 syndicate operators didn't scatter. They immediately identified the unsuppressed muzzle blast originating from the exposed bell tower. 2 of them raised their rifles, sending a hail of automatic fire toward Valeria's position. Bullets cracked through the air inches from her head, showering her face with pulverized brick and stone dust from the belfry archway. She ignored the incoming fire, fighting the primal human instinct to duck. She locked onto the second target in the wedge and fired, dropping him mid-stride. "They are cutting us off," Trench yelled, his voice cracking as his rifle locked back completely empty. "Onyx, we are out of time." The remaining 4 syndicate members, joined by 2 more from the flanks, realized they couldn't outshoot the sniper in the tower. They closed the final distance to the Basilica steps, sprinting directly toward the densest cluster of trapped, screaming tourists, cowering near the massive wooden doors. Through the scope, Valeria watched in horror as the lead figure, a massive man in heavy tactical gear, lunged into the crowd. He wrapped a thick, muscular arm around the neck of a terrified civilian woman, violently pulling her into his chest to form a human shield. He raised his submachine gun, pointing it directly at Trench, who was now utterly defenseless and exposed on the open steps. The trap had snapped shut. The massive syndicate mercenary wrapped a thick arm around the terrified civilian woman's neck, violently dragging her backward against his heavy tactical armor. He used her as a fleshy barricade, positioning her perfectly between the exposed steps of the Basilica and the sniper in the bell tower. Behind the mercenary, 5 more elite shooters fanned out in a disciplined arc, raising their suppressed submachine guns to execute the cornered Aegis team. Corporate says weapons free on anyone advancing on the asset. We need a path, Onyx, 10 seconds before they completely overrun us and take the drive. Trench's voice was a frantic, ragged roar over the comms. He was kneeling on the marble steps, completely out of ammunition, shielding the bleeding AI engineer with his own body. Through the thermal optic of the AI AXSR Valeria Onyx, Silva watched the nightmare unfold in glowing absolute clarity. From 690 meters away, the physics of the situation were cold and undeniable. "Onyx, take the shot, fucking shoot!" The former SEAL roared, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of incoming fire bleeding through his mic. Valeria exhaled, letting the last breath of her corporate cynical detachment leave her lungs forever. The reticle rested perfectly between the hostile's eyes, hovering dangerously low over the sobbing woman's shoulder. The corporate contract didn't cover collateral damage. The old Valeria would have lowered the rifle, preserved her own legal immunity, and watched her team die. But the old Valeria was already dead. Her finger slipped inside the trigger guard. She did not hesitate. Valeria pulled the trigger. The heavy sniper rifle roared, bucking violently against her shoulder on the exposed stone ledge. A 250-grain armor-piercing .338 Lapua Magnum bullet exited the muzzle at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It tore across the swirling, chaotic airspace of the Piazza del Plebiscito in less than a second. The terminal ballistics were unforgiving. The heavy round punched clean through the right shoulder of the civilian woman. The massive kinetic energy did not stop. It overpenetrated, traveling directly through her flesh and slamming into the center of the mercenary's hardened faceplate behind her. Through the thermal lens, Valeria watched the primary threat's heat signature violently snap backward and instantly collapse onto the cobblestones. The civilian woman folded simultaneously, dropping to the ground in a sprawling, agonizing heap, a dark splash of arterial heat blooming rapidly on her shoulder. Valeria's soul fractured, the moral weight of the shot crushing her chest like an anvil. But her training overrode her horror. Time dilated. The chronometer in her mind began ticking. 1 target down, 41 seconds. She violently racked the bolt back, ejecting the smoking brass casing over the edge of the tower, and slammed a new round into the chamber. The remaining 5 mercenaries froze for a fraction of a microsecond, shocked by the brutal sacrificial geometry of the shot. Then they reacted. 2 of them broke left toward the marble columns. The other 3 raised their weapons simultaneously toward the bell tower, trying to suppress the exposed sniper. Clack. The bolt locked. Valeria didn't flinch as 5.56mm rounds began striking the ancient brickwork inches from her elbows, showering her face in razor-sharp stone splinters. She tracked the closest shooter on the right flank. He was mid-stride, bringing his optic to his eye. Valeria's crosshairs intersected his chest. She fired. The thunderclap of the rifle echoed off the basilica walls. The mercenary was lifted off his feet and thrown backward into a souvenir kiosk. 2 down, 34 seconds. Clack. The bolt cycled. The brass burned her forearm as it ejected, but she didn't feel it. She swung the heavy muzzle to the left, catching a syndicate operator attempting to flank Trench's pinned position. The hostile dove for the cover of the obelisk base. Valeria fired the instant his knees bent. The armor-piercing round shattered his pelvis, dropping him instantly in the open. 3 down. 28 seconds. The remaining 3 operators realized the basilica steps were a kill zone. The sniper in the tower wasn't just accurate. She was operating with a ruthless mechanical speed that defied standard suppression tactics. "Move now!" Valeria barked into the radio, her voice a chilling, monotonic rasp. Trench didn't hesitate. He hauled the bleeding AI engineer to his feet and violently shoved him toward the massive wooden doors of the basilica, with Alpha limping heavily behind them. The 3 surviving syndicate members broke cover desperately, trying to shoot Trench in the back before he breached the sanctuary. They ran in a staggered line. Valeria anchored the bipod firmly against the stone ledge, ignoring the blood trickling down her cheek from a shrapnel cut. She settled into a terrifying rhythm. Breathe. Track. Squeeze. Cycle. She fired. The trailing runner's heat signature vanished from the optic as he tumbled headfirst onto the marble stairs. 4 down. 15 seconds. Clack. She tracked the 5th target, who had stopped to aim a burst at the fleeing Alpha. Valeria's round caught him perfectly in the side of the ribcage, the kinetic force folding him completely in half. 5 down, 9 seconds. The final mercenary was only 5 meters from Trench. He raised his weapon, entirely focused on the ex-SEAL's exposed back. Valeria cycled the bolt one last time. The chamber was hot enough to brand flesh. She placed the reticle squarely on the mercenary's helmet. She squeezed the trigger just as Trench and the engineer violently breached the heavy wooden doors of the basilica. The final round struck the mercenary in the back of the head. His body slammed forward into the heavy oak doors, just as they swung shut, sealing Trench Alpha and the asset safely inside the dark, cavernous church. 6 down. 0 seconds. The deafening echoes of the unsuppressed .338 Lapua Magnum rolled across the Piazza del Plebiscito, slowly fading into the wailing of distant police sirens and the localized moans of the trampled crowd. Valeria lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking so violently she could barely disengage the bipod from the stone ledge. She pulled herself back into the suffocating shadows of the belfry and collapsed against the ancient brick wall. She looked through the optic one last time. The 6 syndicate operators were dead, their thermal signatures slowly cooling on the steps. Trench and the asset were safe. She had done exactly what she set out to do. She had saved her team, but near the base of the stairs, the civilian woman lay perfectly still, a rapidly expanding pool of hot red thermal data spreading across the cold Italian cobblestones. Valeria closed her eyes, but the image was permanently burned into her mind. She had saved her team, but she had paid for their lives with the blood of an innocent. There was no contract left to hide behind. She was a monster, and the silence in the bell tower was suddenly far too loud. The ringing in Valeria's ears was a high, sustained note of pure titanium, drowning out the wailing symphony of carabinieri sirens converging on Piazza del Plebiscito. She remained slumped against the ancient brick of the belfry, her breathing ragged, staring blindly at her own trembling hands. The adrenaline crash hit her with the physical violence of a car wreck. Her muscles seized, burning with lactic acid, and a wave of nausea rolled violently through her stomach. For 10 years, she had insulated herself with the cold, unfeeling armor of the private military contractor. She had killed targets, neutralized assets, and eliminated liabilities. But she had never knowingly, intentionally pulled a trigger when an innocent life was in the direct path of her bullet. The blood on the cobblestones below wasn't just collateral damage. It was a choice. Her choice. Valeria forced her eyes open. She could not afford the luxury of a breakdown. Not yet. Aegis Defense had betrayed them, the syndicate was likely sending reinforcements, and the Italian authorities were about to lock down the entire grid. She had less than 3 minutes to vanish. She pushed herself off the brick wall, her movements stiff but mechanically precise. The first rule of a compromised hide was absolute sterilization. She knelt on the wooden floorboards, her gloved hands sweeping the dust. She found the massive, scalding hot point, 338 Lapua Magnum brass casings. One by one, she picked them up, dropping them into the dump pouch on her belt. 1 for the drone, 6 for the syndicate operators. Her fingers lingered on the second casing, the one that had ended 2 lives. The brass was still warm, carrying the heat of the chamber and the ghost of the woman on the steps. Valeria swallowed hard, shoving the casing deep into the pouch. She pulled a chemical solvent wipe from her vest and rapidly scrubbed the stone ledge where her bipod had rested, destroying any microscopic trace of gunpowder residue or synthetic fibers. She keyed her throat mic one last time. Trench. The hide is sterilized. I am displacing. Going dark. Copy Onyx. We are in the dark. Awaiting your arrival. Trench's voice crackled back, faint and distorted by the thick stone of the basilica's substructure. Valeria reached down and violently twisted the locking pins on the AIA-XSR chassis. With practiced fluid motions, she broke the heavy sniper rifle down into 3 primary components, barrel stock and optic, and slid them into the concealed padded compartments of an Eberle-stock teardown pack. She stripped off her heavy tactical chest rig, rolling it tightly and shoving it into the bottom of the bag. Finally, she pulled a lightweight, nondescript tourist windbreaker over her dark operational clothing. She hoisted the heavy pack onto her shoulders. She was no longer Onyx, the Tier 1 Overwatch. She was just another face in the crowd. The descent down the spiraling, claustrophobic stone stairs of the bell tower was an agonizing blur. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and centuries of mold, completely replacing the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. As she reached the ground floor, she bypassed the main sanctuary entrance and slipped toward a heavy, iron-reinforced maintenance door used by the groundskeepers. She cracked the door open a fraction of an inch. Outside, the side alley was bathed in the strobe light glare of blue and red police flashers. The roar of the panicked crowd had been replaced by the chaotic shouting of first responders and the sharp, authoritative barks of heavily armed carabinieri locking down the perimeter. Valeria waited for a pair of medics to sprint past her hiding spot, then slipped out of the doorway, keeping her head down. She didn't run. Running attracted the eye. She moved with a measured, terrified civilian limp blending into the shadows of the alleyway until she reached a rusted iron grate set flush into the cobblestones. It was an access point to the Naples Sotterranea, the vast ancient network of geothermal tunnels and catacombs that ran like veins beneath the city. Trench's team had mapped it as their ultimate worst-case secondary exfil route. She hauled the heavy grate upward, the rusted iron biting into her palms, and dropped into the suffocating darkness below, pulling the grate shut behind her. The air in the catacombs was freezing thick with the smell of volcanic ash and old bones. Valeria clicked on a low-output red-lens tactical flashlight, keeping the beam pointed strictly at the uneven, tough stone floor. She navigated the labyrinthine tunnels entirely by memory and compass heading, moving deeper beneath the basilica. 10 minutes later, the faint glow of a chemical light stick broke the absolute darkness. Valeria stepped into a widened burial crypt. Alpha was sitting on a stone sarcophagus, his face completely drained of color, his hands gripping a blood-soaked tourniquet ratcheted high on his thigh. In the corner, the AI engineer was curled into a tight, shivering ball, desperately clutching the reinforced metallic briefcase to his chest. The billion-dollar algorithm was safe. The payoff for their corporate contract was fully secured. It meant absolutely nothing. Trench stood in the center of the crypt. He had stripped his tactical gear, his arms covered in a mixture of stone dust and Alpha's blood. He was methodically loading loose 5.56mm rounds into an empty magazine, his face illuminated by the eerie green glow of the chem light. He stopped as Valeria entered. The silence in the crypt was heavier than the stone above them. Trench looked at her. He looked at the blood drying on her cheek from the stone shrapnel. He didn't ask about the drone. He didn't ask about the 6 syndicate bodies on the steps. As a former Tier 1 operator, he knew exactly how the geometry of the plaza worked. He knew the angle she had been forced to take, and he knew the civilian casualty that the news networks were currently broadcasting across the globe. "You took the shot," Trench said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a judgment. It was the heavy, crushing acknowledgement of a burden that would never go away. Valeria stopped the weight of the Eberlestock pack, suddenly feeling like it was going to snap her spine. She met the ex-SEAL's eyes in the dim green light. She didn't hide behind the excuse of orders, and she didn't offer a hollow justification about saving the team. "I took the shot," Valeria whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "The contract is broken, Marcus. Aegis tried to burn us, and I just gave them the match." Trench slammed the loaded magazine into his rifle and racked the charging handle with a violent, echoing clack. "Oh, they don't get to burn us," Trench said, his eyes hardening into twin chips of ice. "They made us break the rules. Now we use the engineer's drive to break the corporation. We are officially rogue." 36 hours later, the air inside the decommissioned NATO communications bunker outside of Rome tasted of stale copper and recycled oxygen. Valeria Onyx Silva stood perfectly still in the center of the subterranean concrete room. The heavy Eberlestock teardown pack rested at her feet, alongside the shattered, discarded remains of her Aegis Defense tactical comms rig. Across the room, Alpha lay heavily sedated on a rusted cot, his leg heavily bandaged and tightly bound with a fresh tourniquet. Trench stood by the reinforced steel door, a suppressed short-barreled rifle resting on a one-point sling against his chest. His eyes were hollow-rimmed with the deep purple exhaustion of a man who had not slept since the bloodshed in Naples. In the center of the bunker, bathed in the harsh blue-white glare of a ruggedized Panasonic toughbook, sat the AI engineer. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic, terrified rhythm. Connected to the laptop via a heavily shielded offline decryption cradle was the metallic briefcase, the billion-dollar AI source code. "I have bypassed the proprietary locks," the engineer whispered, his voice trembling in the cavernous silence. "I have established a secure, heavily routed one-time uplink to the Aegis Defense primary mainframe in Geneva. They are on the line." Valeria stepped into the glow of the screen. She didn't put on a headset. She reached down and tapped the speaker icon, filling the concrete bunker with the sterile, synthesized voice of Control. Hi, Valeria Silva. Marcus Cole. You are currently in violation of multiple non-disclosure agreements and are in possession of highly classified corporate assets. You have caused a catastrophic loss of shareholder value. The voice was devoid of anger or panic. It was the terrifying measured tone of a balance sheet correcting itself. You deployed a Valkyrie hunter-killer drone to eliminate your own Overwatch. Valeria replied, her voice an icy, razor-sharp drawl. You sold your extraction team to a local syndicate to avoid paying the operational fee. The contract is terminated. Control. A calculated risk mitigation. Control responded smoothly, the audio slightly degraded by the heavy encryption routing. However, the board is willing to renegotiate your severance. Return the AI drive intact to a designated dead drop in Zurich. In exchange, we will erase you. Valeria crossed her arms. You don't have the leverage to make deals. We have all the leverage, Ms. Silva, Control countered. A high-resolution thermal video file suddenly materialized on the laptop screen. It was paused. Before you destroyed the Valkyrie platform, it transmitted a continuous 4-kilo resolution data stream to our servers. We have the exact telemetry of your final engagement on the Basilica steps. Valeria stared at the screen. It was the exact angle from the sky. It showed the massive syndicate mercenary using the civilian woman as a human shield. It showed the brilliant, blinding streak of the .338 Lapua Magnum round, originating from the bell tower. It showed the devastating over-penetration. The Italian Carabinieri and Europol are aggressively hunting the rogue sniper who murdered an innocent civilian in Piazza del Plebiscito. Control stated, the synthesized voice dripping with absolute corporate malice. Deliver the drive and we permanently scrub this footage. You become ghosts. Refuse and this unedited feed is uploaded to Interpol's Red Notice database in exactly 5 minutes. You will spend the rest of your life in an unmarked black site. Silence crashed over the bunker. Trench shifted his weight, his hand tightening around the pistol grip of his rifle. He looked at Valeria, offering no input, entirely willing to follow whatever choice she made. Valeria looked at the paused thermal image. She saw the bright splash of red heat blooming on the cobblestones. In the old days, the mercenary known as Onyx would have accepted the deal instantly. She would have traded the drive for her freedom, allowing Aegis to delete the woman's death like a clerical error. But Valeria felt the heavy phantom burn of the brass casing she still carried in her pocket. Erasing the footage didn't erase the sin. It only erased the woman's existence. It reduced a human life to a corporate liability clause. Valeria Silva was no longer a liability manager. She was a killer who finally owned her ghosts. No, Valeria said softly. She reached over the engineer's trembling shoulder and typed a rapid sequence of commands into the terminal. What are you doing? The engineer gasped. I am changing the severance package, Valeria said. She initiated a dead man's switch protocol she had prepared hours ago. She didn't just reject the deal. She weaponized the engineer's drive. The highly advanced AI source code acted as a zero-day exploit, violently smashing through Aegis Defense's heavily fortified firewalls in Geneva. De-uploading, Valeria announced clinically. I am dumping Aegis's encrypted ledgers, the syndicate payoff receipts, and the Valkyrie deployment orders directly to Europol, Interpol, and 50 independent global news agencies. Ms. Silva, abort this sequence immediately. You are destroying your own immunity. Control's voice finally fractured, a jagged edge of genuine panic bleeding through the synthesizer. Valeria looked at the thermal footage of her fatal shot. I don't want your immunity. With a final decisive keystroke, Valeria attached the unedited video file of her own shot, along with her complete ballistic telemetry and a signed, digitized confession to the global data dump. She burned the corporation to the ground, and she threw herself into the exact same fire. She hit the enter key. The progress bar flashed instantly to 100%. The connection severed. Valeria unplugged the reinforced metallic drive from the cradle. She dropped the billion-dollar piece of hardware onto the concrete floor and brought the heavy heel of her tactical boot down on it with crushing force. The composite casing shattered the delicate platters inside, grinding into useless, unsalvageable dust. "It's done," Valeria said, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding since Naples. She hoisted the heavy Eberlestock pack onto her shoulders. "Aegis is dead. The authorities know exactly who to look for. We need to move. Now." Trench offered a single grim nod of absolute respect. He hauled Alpha to his feet, slinging the wounded man's arm over his shoulder. Valeria walked out of the bunker, pushing open the heavy steel blast doors. The cool, quiet European dawn washed over her face, completely devoid of the suffocating heat of the Mediterranean sun. She was a rogue operator, now a hunted ghost, who would never know true safety again. She stepped out into the tree line, leaving the ruins of her corporate life behind. The forest was perfectly still. The world around her was quiet now. But as she adjusted the heavy strap of the sniper rifle on her shoulder, she knew the truth. In her mind, the plaza would always be too loud. "Onyx, we are blind down here. The plaza is too loud. Do you have PID on the primary?"